Unveiling the face of hidden domestic violence in Uganda. Have you ever considered the domestic violence, that it isn't just about the issue faced by only women in Uganda? Yes, I don't know how you would then think about domestic violence in Uganda. You know, according to a 2019 study, it indicated that around 8% of Ugandan men had experienced emotional and physical abuse, of course, from their partners. But figures could be much greater than this, of course, basing on underreported similar occurrences. Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Edwin Twinomujisha, and an advocate for men in Uganda, especially the way men are supposed to live. Today I rise not to speak for a far-off tale, but to expose the truth hidden in the plain sight, and of course the truth that sits uncomfortably in the shadow of all our conversations on domestic violence that kills men in silence. Yes, I speak of the battered, bruised, and broken voices of men. Yes, I mean men silenced by shame, the fear, and societal mockery, of course, which makes it very hard for them to believe from reality, especially the way we live in Uganda. Yes, as one author and an advocate, Jackson Katz, once said, violence and intimidation aren't confined to any gender, but cuts across all boundaries, affecting men as well as women. Ladies and gentlemen, in our society, a man is expected to be a pillar, a protector, a provider, because of that high sense and belief of masculinity. But then, what happens when the protector becomes the victim? I want us to reflect on this. What really happens when the strong is ashamed to speak? When the strong is very weak, speak out of the reality. Ladies and gentlemen, you will allow me to take you briefly to the small village in Rushenyi, where some friend of mine called Julius, of course I will use a different name for protection of this man. Yes, this gentleman, Rushenyi, is in the western Uganda. This gentleman, he once shared his story on our local radio station. He shared how his wife used it to batter him, used it to starve him of food, and sometimes lock him out of the house. But immediately he shared this story on the local radio station. The story went viral, and guess what? It was later on reported to police, but the police instead, they had to really laugh out loudly for this gentleman, because they felt like he was not a man enough to be speaking out what is happening to him. To a 2021 report of Uganda Bureau of Statistics, 4 in every 10 cases of domestic abuse reported by men go uninvestigated. And this is simply because, it's not simply because they lack merit, but rather these cases are put on the gender-based dominance, where they think that men are not supposed to be going through this kind of violence. Well, we have done well to highlight the plight of women in abusive relationships, and rightly so. But now, time has come to balance the scales of justice and acknowledge the male victims as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to share another story of a teacher called David, of course, for the change of name, in Kampala, who is a school teacher, and his wife once poured hot water all over his body, and his face and the chest still carries some scars. This was a shock to the doctor when the man stood to simply say that it was done accidentally. But of course, he was only fearing because people had to laugh at him for believing that men are not supposed to report the same case. I want us to understand that it's a privilege to be a man, but it's very hard to be a man. Many men are crying of course, with dry faces, screaming in whispers, calling for help. But all this is not coming true because people still believe that men are not supposed to cry this. Well, it's often the fruit of deep-rooted frustration, economic pressure, alcoholism, sometimes trauma, and yes, all these cases, they come from the fear of women being empowered, and then they end up causing the same violence that are very preached against them. What must we then do? We must change the narrative. Let's start acknowledging that domestic violence knows no gender. Men can be victims too, and women can as well be perpetrators. It's not a weakness of a man to speak out of this. It's indeed a strength. We must equip our institutions, police, hospitals, and community leaders must be trained to handle male victim reports with seriousness and empathy, not being ridiculous to think that men cannot go through the same cases of violence. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, through my Edwin Foundation, I call upon the international communities and human rights organizations and every other heart that beats for justice in this world to come with and we stand together so that we can confront this silent crisis. Let's become the voice of those who dare not to speak, the strength for those who are too broken to stand. For God and my country, I remain Edwin Twinomujisha. I thank you all for listening to me.